Hi, Richard. How you doing?
I'm good, my man. How are you?
I'm hanging in there. I'm hanging in there. I'm really excited to have you here today to chat with us and our lovely audience here at Modern Sales Pros Revenue Excellence Summit. Are you a member of the League of Extraordinary Sellers? Are you a member?
I have no idea. I don't even know what it is, but I would like to think I'm an honorary member. So yeah.
Yeah, I
No.
feel yeah, although I feel that you're kind of like a Professor X kind of like pattern there, like teaching and cultivating extraordinary sellers.
I
Cool.
certainly have the Professor X hairline.
There you go. Yeah, 100%. Cool. Well, everyone, thanks for joining us. You guys are in for a treat today. Um, obviously, folks who are here watching and listening are Modern Sales Pros members, and if you pay attention at all to the Modern Sales Pros forum, you see Richard kind of popping off in there on a fairly frequent basis. Dropping knowledge, helping folks out. Engaging in peer education, which of course is what MSP is for. So he's going to do some live peer education here today, right, Richard?
That's the goal.
We're going to talk about CFOs and making sure that they don't blow up deals and making sure that they sign off on deals and do so in an
Yes.
expedient fashion. Yeah, I think this is going to be
Yes.
super fun. So, folks, for people who don't know me, my name is Pete Kazanjy. I'm one of the founders here at Atrium, also founder of Modern Sales Pro. So Atrium makes sales performance management software that helps sales organizations better measure, manage, and improve the performance of their teams. And we do so through better manager empowerment and effectiveness, better encouragement, better coaching, better accountability, all those things, the bundle of things that is management and sales management. So that's me. And then Richard here, folks may know him through his work at the Harris Consulting Group, and also his writings and his various education content. But Richard, maybe you can kind of give folks a little bit of content on what you worked on before the Harris Consulting Group and kind of what you spend your time doing,
Yeah.
these
Yeah.
days.
Yeah. Happy to do so. So, at the high level, it's, coaching founder-led sales and sales teams on how to earn the right to ask questions, which questions to ask and when to do it in terms of driving revenue, right? Like, so that's the bulk of my business. I did actually just write a book called The Seller's Journey.
There we are.
There we are, talking a lot about this stuff in two levels. One, at the psychological, what's the right mindset for a salesperson, really making sure that we own what we do. And first chapter is called Yes, I'm in Sales, and let's be proud of it. And then there's 13 tactics of, like, this is the stuff that's not taught to people that needs to be, which as we talk about CFOs, this is one of those kind of things that nobody taught us how to do. We just sort of were thrown into it in sales. It's really interesting. We are sales surgeons, but we don't have to go to medical school to do it, right? So it's like they're asking us to go and perform brain surgery with people in terms of negotiation and closing, but then there's been not enough education, at least as I was coming through the ranks. I think there's a whole lot more now, which is wonderful, but it's still a missed opportunity. So.
Yep, for sure. The yeah, I definitely hear that, and we see this quite a bit as relates to our customers here at Atrium, where you're talking about education of individual sellers, and then of course there's education and enablement and training of sales managers who
Right.
are responsible for the thing that you just talked about, so making reps better, et cetera, et cetera. So if you kind of have if you're not doing sufficient enablement and sufficient investment there, you kind of have like a blind leading the blind sort of situation, which I hear that's not really good for attainment.
No, it really doesn't, but it's kind of like we do that because it's a copycat league, and that's what we've always done,
Yeah.
right? Which is also interesting too, because founders are so instrumental in in the world you and I live in. They're so instrumental in change and getting the world better and making the world a better place. Like, sure, you built Atrium for the sake of, like, yeah, let's make some money, but it is making people better. It is helping people. Yet when it comes to helping ourselves, we're really bad at it. Salespeople in general are the biggest instigators of change Everything we do is about instigating change within our prospects and customers.
Mhm.
Yet we're the hardest people to convince to change ourselves. And it's very interesting in that regard, which is why I like these topics of like, well, let's talk about stuff that we don't get to talk about a lot.
Yeah, for sure. Well, so I think this is going to be all CFO all the time, and I think today, and I think the reason why I think that this is timely and relevant for folks, and we're seeing this quite a bit across our customer base. And I think we're seeing this across the market. Is selling behaviors have require change now, especially in the last probably 18 months. I want to
Yeah.
say last 18 months or so, where in the maybe the few years, like the 5, maybe 10, but probably not 5. It was probably like 3 to 7 years that preceded the last 18 months. You really had a kind of an atypical selling environment where budgets were very loose. You had a lot of devolution of power and, like, purchasing decision making at out of the finance level and then down to the line of business, or even under the line of business. And this has been a big change for us as we've gone up market and are now selling to 100, 200, 300 person sales organizations. 24 months ago, 36 months ago, we were sliding into organizations and transacting at a single sales manager level, right? Because those folks 24 months ago or 36 months ago, they actually had purchasing authority where they could make a decision to
Did
say,
they
like, yeah,
really? Did they
yeah,
really have authority, or did they have authority to go get approval?
yeah. But that's what I mean, is it was very permissive, right? And that is not the
Right.
case anymore, right?
Correct.
And so I think that that's a big change here. So I think one thing that might be kind of useful for folks, and this is something I've been doing with my staff quite a bit, is just making sure that people understand, like, what the roles are and, like, what the persona is. So maybe we could talk about that a little bit. Like,
Yeah.
what is, like, people hear about this, like, oh, the CFO, oh, or oh, the VP of finance, and it's like, oh, okay, cool. Like, do you know what they do and what their responsibilities are, or how they're measured, and, like, what is success for them and how they earn their bonus and what have you?
Yeah.
They're like, no, I'm just scared of them. Okay, cool.
Right.
So maybe we can demystify that a little bit here for the
Yeah.
first couple of minutes. It's like, what does that person do? What are they responsible for? And
Yeah.
then we can kind of use that as a platform to kind of extend the
Yeah.
conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm going to say this, we won't go all the way down this route, but I often, when I hear CFO, particularly Pete, you can tell me, it, CFO could also be a procurement team, right?
Mhm.
You may not, as you get up to market, right, you may be working more with a procurement team than a CFO, but depending on who our audience is here today, that CFO may be the procurement team, right? So just as you hear these things, you can think about both of those things, but we'll talk about CFOs. Look,
Yep.
a CFO's responsibility is to protect the financial integrity of an organization,
That's right.
right?
Make
That's
make
their
sure we
job.
don't run out of make sure we don't run out of cash
Yeah.
now, in 12 months, in 24 months, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
Yeah, great.
And there's nothing wrong with that. Like, if you think about the rest of us in our personal lives, we all have some level of a financial responsibility, right? Whether you put a budget down on paper or you just do it in your head, but you're trying to learn how to be responsible with your own money, right? Now, the title creates an inflated ego. The title creates the ability to give them power, because they actually do have power, and they can say no whenever they want. And, they're a little bit like a grumpy father. No, because I said so. Right. And so I think you have to understand the persona. Not all CFOs are that way. But if you at least understand a little bit about that, you can go into a conversation going, well, gosh, how would I negotiate spring break with my parents, knowing that my mom and dad are going to say no right away?
Mhm.
Because you can't use a sales approach. You've got to come in with a big thing for me in general right now is about the humanity in sales. Everybody's a human, so let's figure that out. So
Yeah.
I'll pause there and see where you want to go. But
Yeah.
that's what is your interpretation, right? Because you deal with CFOs and procurement teams and stuff.
I mean, I think the high level description that you offered there is right. It's, they're responsible for the financial well-being of the organization, and I think the other thing that they're responsible for is like making sure that the organization is making good use of funds. And
Yep.
so that can mean that can mean purchasing less of something, which is usually the default, right? Like, hey, we're
Right.
gonna cancel this thing, we're gonna cancel this. Are you using that anymore? We're gonna cancel this, we're gonna reduce spend. But sometimes that can actually mean more heavily investing in something.
Yes.
It can.
Right.
And so people are like, wait a minute, what? Um,
Yeah.
but ultimately that's what they're responsible for. And they don't really do it kind of like at the tactical level. And we'll talk about this as relates to like
Yeah.
budgets, because and this can be a pretty big challenge where like the CFO doesn't give a hoot about the functionality of the detailed functionality of your product that the VP of marketing buys, or the VP of
Yeah.
sales buys, or the VP of CS buys, or the VP of HR buys, or whatever. In fact, it's all probably kind of Greek to them,
Yeah.
because they're very distant from the line of business, if you
Yes.
will. um, and so that but what they are responsible for is putting controls around that and saying, hey, these are the various dollops of money that you have purview over. And if you want to expend a large amount of that dollop of money, right, that's maybe above a certain threshold or whatever, you're going to have to get additional approval to me, because we don't want someone to accidentally go to your point about parents or whatever. Here's your allowance, but if you're going to spend, and honestly though, I don't want you to spend it all on Skittles,
Right.
right? Or here's your lunch money, and like I'm going to give you your lunch money at the beginning of the week, but if you're going to go and make a move to blow the entire week's worth of lunch money on Skittles on Monday, I'm going to want to have controls around that,
Yes.
right? And so I think that that's another thing to kind of be mindful of there, especially as relates to some of these larger transactions, when maybe your champion's like, yeah, this is my budget, this is my budget, this is my lunch money. It's like, it is
But
ish.
it's not.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it is.
Ish.
It is ish, right?
Right.
And I think that's a really important thing to do. So, like, the CFO is kind of a combination of like a parent, you know, um, like a little bit of like a Jerome Powell kind of Ben Bernanke sort
Right.
of thing, right? Like central banker, where hey, we're gonna pull money out of here and we're gonna put money over here. We're gonna like lever, like we're potentially gonna purchase more. But ultimately, what they're responsible for is like the money flows within the organization, right?
Yep.
And so
100%.
they're not down in the weeds. That's like kind of where they're operating. And I think this is actually a really interesting thing is, um, who do they report to, and then what makes them successful, right?
Yep.
Because I'll use us as an example. Our primary purchaser here at Atrium, we have a two-legged sale. The primary person is going to be a CRO or like an SVP of sales in a 50, 100, 200 person sales organization or what have you. So you might say like, whoa, the CRO of like a 300 person sales organization, that's like probably the most important person in that company, maybe besides like the CEO or what have you. Yeah, kind of, right? Kind of. And so I think at the end of the day, the CFO is the person who has who has final authority on dispersal of funds, right? And so, even though you might think like, oh, I'm working with the COO, and they have this amazing title, or I'm working with the CRO and they have this amazing title, or like, who knows, I'm working with the CEO and they have this title or what have you. The CFO still, it like ultimately is responsible both to the CEO and then also the board to defend the
Yep.
financial well-being of the organization.
Yeah.
So it's important to
It's
remember that.
interesting. Yeah, because if you think about it, I think the CFO reports to the board, and here's why.
Yeah, they kind of don't report to the CEO.
Not at all, because
Yeah.
how often does the CEO leave versus the CFO leave?
Mhm.
Every story you hear, if a CEO is leaving because it's poor leadership, rarely is the CFO. Now they may be leaving and they're not getting the headlines because they're not a CEO, and that's just right. We want to know about that, but CFOs have way more power and control. I also find it interesting too. In the last year, like particularly as you go up market, if you're selling to 50, 100, 200, 300 person units within an organization. I know Atrium sells to sales teams. the biggest challenge I see, and I've seen it before now, is that you're not an SVP if you can't spend that money without getting your CFO's approval. You are not a COO if you have to go get approval from the CFO. Like that just tells me that the organization is immature at a management level because there's a lack of trust. And or in startup world, decisions are made by committee anyway. So I never believe my champion. Pete, I can't remember the last time I talked to anybody, small or big company, who didn't have to go have a conversation with somebody else.
Mhm.
Right. I'm talking about VPs of sales, CROs. Like, okay, you're the decision. Well, I still need to go have an internal meeting with so-and-so. I'm like, for what? You're a fucking chief CRO. Sorry if you need to bleep that, but like, you're not a chief of anything if you have to go get approval. Sorry. You're not a senior of anything if you have to go get approval. Like, it's to your allowance scenario, right? Allowance is one thing. I don't care. I don't care what my kids spend allowance on. I see it because they have a card. But if they run out of money by the end of the week, that's not my problem. Now, that's different than lunch money. I get you on the lunch money. But their allowance is their allowance. They've got to learn how to make mistakes. So
Yeah, and I think that that's actually an interesting point there, and I like to talk about the little bit as relates to purchasing thresholds.
Yeah.
And also the difference between budgeted, unbudgeted,
Yeah.
and discretionary budget. So maybe actually we can kind of flip that around and we can talk about the concept of budgeted, discretionary budget,
Yeah.
and unbudgeted. So
Yeah.
I think to kind of help, I'm actually doing a training on this with my staff here soon. Like the operating rhythms of most large organizations, like kind of dictate the way that they do purchasing decisions. And the reason why is this: like essentially, most organizations do planning in a yearly capacity. They say, hey, this is like probably what we're gonna like. This is what we're intending to do for the year. We want to grow revenue by this amount, and then these are the components that go into that revenue. So, we want to grow revenue by this amount. That means this many deals. That means, at this win rate with this average selling price and this deal cycle. Okay, cool. Well, that means this many opportunities or this amount of pipeline, et cetera, which then means this amount of marketing and this amount of like program, and like it all kind of backs out. So like, hey, we want to grow 30% this year. We want to grow 100% this year. We want to grow whatever. And then you kind of like back out of that. And so they say, great, that's what our intention is to do. And then there's a plan, a budgetary plan to go against it. This amount of humans that cost this amount of money, this many SDRs, this many account executives, this many CSMs that catch the customers that come out of sales, this many marketers doing this many programs, this amount of tooling in support of all of those humans. So that's kind of how that gets done. And so then there's a budgetary discussion of like, if we're going to grow like this, and are we going to do that out of profits, or are we going to spend out of cash, right? Like in a lot of organizations, they are venture backed. Are we going to burn cash in order to drive that revenue through these items, right? Through these, like this headcount, through these like purchasing leads, through LinkedIn, or through SDR activity, or what have you. So that's that. And then that budget gets then baked in that regard. These are the number of humans. This is when the humans are going to show up in which month, and this is their cost. This is like the software seat costs associated with this. This is the marketing spend, et cetera, et cetera. And then that is the plan for the year. The plan, capital P. Right, and we're gonna manage to that budget. And so within that, oftentimes there might be a budgeted expense. Like, okay, cool, we're gonna have this many. We have 100 sellers, and we've got 15 managers, and each of those managers has like an Atrium seat, and each of those sellers has an Apollo seat, and
And a
each of
Salesforce or a
and a
HubSpot.
Salesforce, et cetera, right?
What's
And
in the
like
stack?
that's essentially budgeted in November or December or January or whatever. And then within that budget, here's the sales organization and all their headcounts and all their tooling and I'm just fixated on the sales organization because I'm familiar with that through Atrium. But then there will be a bucket within there called discretionary, right? Richard's kids allowance, if you will, right? Different than lunch money. Lunch money, that's budgeted. Got to feed you. Oh, discretionary? It's like if you see something that's interesting to you, like, oh, okay, cool. My son Mikey, he's really into Pokemon. And it's
Yep.
like, oh, okay, cool. If you see a Pokemon book and that like, you just started reading and like you're really excited about that, okay, yeah, it wasn't budgeted, right? It's not it's not his it's not lunch money. It's discretionary, and you get that with different leaders as well. So the VP of marketing, VP of sales, et cetera, will have discretionary funds. And so I think one thing that's actually really interesting is to think about how that budgeted spend and then the discretionary spend potentially connects to sellers and like sellers that are seeking to sell to an organization, right? So maybe Richard, you can kind of like delineate for folks
Yeah. So
the difference of like when you're going after one versus the other.
so it's interesting. I don't worry about that too much, right? I might ask my champion early on, where are the funds coming from for this, right? But if I've done my job well, everything's a little bit discretionary, even at big organizations, because you can have this set budget that's assigned for these certain tools. However, any smart business leader, again, we're talking about people who sell into sales, right? Like that's where our where we gravitate. They'll find the money. I'm telling you, they will find it. And the key is being able to drive to the economic impact to show not ROI. I fucking hate ROI, right? ROI is a myth, it's a lie, and it's a scare tactic that CFOs use because nobody's going to believe it. And it's about some future state that nobody can predict, right? Economic impact. What is the pain now? How much is it costing you now? What is the delay going to be if you don't solve this problem? How much is that costing you in people hours, in real hours, and then the opportunity cost associated with those lost people hours? That's economic impact. And if you give that level of information to your champion and your CFO, they can still say no because they don't have the budget, but I don't care if they don't have the budget. I need to make sure I present myself in such a way that they're going to feel silly. And again, I wouldn't say it in this tone, in a real CFO conversation. They're going to feel silly that I just told them that, look, you've got a $553,000 problem and my service is 20 grand a year. And you're going to tell me you don't have budget.
Yeah.
So
so I think
I understand your point of like, this is how they think. We're trying to understand the concept of how CFOs operate and why they do have to have a finite budget. They have to have this stuff set aside. But from a sales perspective, okay, right. I got to do my job because if I wait for them to tell me, well, we don't really have a budget for your tool or service. Okay, thanks.
Well, I think that's actually important. So the reason why I was delineating that for folks is that oftentimes what ends up happening is that like if your service is of a large enough magnitude, right,
yes,
that it requires being in the budget, then that will have impacts associated with your deal cycle and also how you should approach things. So if you're trying to jam $150,000 transaction into an organization in like June, as an example, right? That's probably unbudgeted, I would imagine.
yes,
right? Because it's in the middle of the year and it hasn't been planned for. And so either there's two kind of tactical things that you would want to do there. Either A, get their like somehow split up that service into something that can slide into a discretionary budget, or what Richard is talking about, and actually I think that this is the thing that I'd like to expand on here, is how do we make budget? And this is something that oftentimes, like the reason why I'm rehearsing this for folks and kind of how this works is my father would say, like, you asked me what time it was, you told me how to build a watch, is because a lot of times account executives actually don't know how this stuff works. They say, oh, they don't have budget. It's like,
right.
if there's cash in the bank,
There's
right,
budget.
then there is budget. It's just a question of getting it from mom or getting it from dad.
Yeah.
And so let's pretend that we're not trying to slide in under some sort of threshold, which you
Yeah.
can do, right? That's kind of what we were talking about as relates to like Atrium sales motion 36 months ago or whatever, where we'd slide into one part of the organization or one manager or what have you, versus going wall to wall from a, an initiative
Yeah.
standpoint. And maybe what we can do is we can talk about initiative-based selling here in a second. But how do you then generate budget or make budget when a transaction is large but
Yeah.
unbudgeted, right?
Yeah. So here's the deal. I hear this all the time, and I hear it even from buyers, and I hear it from salespeople. Is like, well, gosh, if you close one more deal, then we've paid for ourselves. Well, no, you haven't. People say this to me all the time. Well, gosh, Richard, if we close one or two more deals from your sales training, we'll pay for ourselves. I'm like, if you only close one or two more deals from my sales training, then I failed. And I
Yeah.
have to educate people that look, CFOs, leaders, and you got to be willing to say it. And I say it all the time. If I spend $15,000 on sales training, you should expect a 10x or 20x return on that.
Many hundreds of thousands of dollars of
Yes.
incremental sales,
And you've
because
got to do that.
there are lots of other options that are
Yep.
available for them to spend that
Yep.
money on,
And
right?
here's the cool thing about what we do in SaaS, right? Is that number is actually fairly easy to get to because SaaS is about lifetime value.
Mhm.
Right. So it's not like, hey, if your average deal size is 10 grand a year and you got 10 reps and Richard helps you close 10, 10, 5 deals per rep, right? It's not about that number of what the economic impact is. It's the fact of, well, if you have a 3-year LTV, each of those clients is worth 3x that contract because of the sales training someone took or the tool that they bought, right? Atrium's not going to help solve this one rep's problem one time. It's going to have a compounding interest effect. And that's the economic impact. And that's the part that that's the second part that gets left out. One is understanding the economic impact, but you want to get to the CFO, you got to be able to say, well, I'm confused. Your LTV is this. We've shown you this problem. If you extrapolate this out over the LTV, how are my numbers off? And now
Yeah.
the CFO or your champion has to justify their stupidity because they don't want to. And again, I say it crassly here. I wouldn't say it to stone in real life, but to a certain extent, that's what you have to do is you have to kind of slap them upside the face to say, you're not as smart as you think you are. Right. And, it's kind of like EBITDA. Like EBITDA is a tax thing. Like, come on, give me a break. So, or EBITDA, however you want to call it. But, so anyway, I'll shut up now because I'm ranting, but
Yeah, so I think that the when it comes to generating budget for an unbudgeted transaction, oftentimes what people like, again, we're over here and there's the budgeted and then there's the
yeah,
unbudgeted. This is a large transaction. And so what people will talk about is they'll say, hey, ROI. And that the way to kind of think about this, and an important thing for the audience that is watching this right now and also explaining this to your sellers, is this kind of goes back to the Ben Bernanke, Jerome Powell, kind of like central banker sort of thing. The CFO is sitting there and saying, hey, we have these financial resources. And what I'd like to be able to do is in different parts of the business, put $1 in and get $10 out,
yeah,
right? Whether that's, put $1 into HR, whether it's salary expense, or tooling or whatever, and get $10 out in some sort of capacity. Or the same
yeah,
sort, and like Richard was talking about this as relates to sales training. And so then what happens is, if there is a problem that is within the organization, and it has to be a large problem that the CFO was not aware, like the business was not aware of, or that there was a solution, like maybe the business was aware of this thing, right? But they weren't aware that there was a solution that was on offer. And that is new. And that is what the seller is doing, is saying, hey, you may have realized that there was this problem, but you thought that you were going to solve it through headcount or what have you.
yeah.
But
Oh
look,
God.
like we have this magic widget here, and actually what it can do is it can, if you disperse $100,000 or $200,000 or $50,000, yes, I recognize that it's unbudgeted, but this is new information. And given the fact that you have this $500,000 a year problem or $300,000 a year problem or $1 million a year problem, it probably, given this new information, had you known this back in November, right? If we had met 6 months ago, then we probably would be like, then what would have happened is we would have been budgeted. So in this case, now let's make that business argument about how this dollar or this $50,000 or this $100,000 then turns into $1 million in the short term,
And so
in order to justify what is known as the creation of budget, where the CFO says, yeah, you know what we're going to do in order to stay within our plan is we're not going to hire this headcount over here, or we're going to cancel this project over here, and I'm going to reslot this money here, because the ROI on this money deployed here, like, sorry HR, or sorry recruiting, or sorry XYZ, I'm taking your money here and I'm giving it to the VP of Revenue Operations or the VP of Sales Enablement, because this big problem here is now been identified, and I'm going to create that budget.
Yes.
Right. So this
100%.
is something that can happen, but it doesn't happen just because someone's like, it doesn't happen on vibes. Right. And there has to be an argument as to why that. And so maybe what we can kind of talk about is this business case of how you would advance an argument like that. Like, hey, it's worth making a $50,000, $100,000 unbudgeted, non-discretionary purchase here.
Yeah. So there's a couple of things. So one, to do this, right, this goes back to determining the economic impact of the current state. How much is it costing you to do it this way, right? And there's two sides to that coin, right? There is the side of the coin that is the labor side, the human people hours, right? How much time is wasted, getting that time back, right? Now, how much faster can they move, right? So that's the one thing, is the hard cost. The soft costs are, okay, well, if you get half your time back, what are they going to be able to do? Okay, because they can now get to that thing on their to-do list faster, how does that impact the company? How does that drive more business and revenue? And for you, Pete and I, it's a little bit easier. It's like, okay, well now, gosh, my sales leader could now have 7 more coaching calls a week. Great. Okay, what's the value of a coaching call? How much is a new deal worth? What's the lifetime value of that deal? So you have to ask these questions. You can't walk in with your ROI calculator, right? Nobody believes your ROI. They only see the R. They never believe the R. They only see the I. And it's a total scare tactic, right? They never believe. Like, when was the last, like, I would encourage everybody to go to every CFO, even your own internal one, and just say, just out of curiosity, if a sales rep says to you ROI, on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 means you would let them marry your children. How much do you believe them on their ROI calculation? Yeah. And not one, you might get a 2 if you're lucky. You might. Because the other problem we have as salespeople is that we are seen negatively and we are seen as stupid. We just are, right? Whether you like it or not. Okay. That's it. Just the way it is. You know, you can blame Steinbeck if you haven't read Grapes of Wrath in a while. There's a whole thing about car salesmen in there, and that's why it comes from. So the question then is to go into your CFO and first talk to your champion. Okay, how many people? What's your problem? What's the challenge? What's it costing you? What could you do more? What could you do faster? And how much would that affect your business to grow? That's economic impact right now, right? Yeah. That's what it's affecting you. Then when you go to the CFO and you say, well, look, here are the numbers I was given by your team. Would you agree or disagree that this is how expensive the problem is right now? So it's going to be very hard for them to disagree entirely. And if they are, then I'm going to ask them their questions. And you said earlier, they're not in the weeds. They don't really know, right? Look, believe me, CFOs and procurement people, do you know they go to sales training, negotiating tactics? Do you know they actually have courses for people in procurement and CFOs to learn how to negotiate with salespeople? First thing, item number 1, ROI. Never believe it. Use it to scare them and force a discount. Okay? So anyway, I'm going on another rant, but like, I got to tell you, this ROI stuff is hard. It's so easy to make them, like, I have literally said to CFOs, just out of curiosity, if I show you an ROI from your direct competitor who I've worked with, would you believe it? Would you believe it? If I'm talking to Coke and I've already worked with Pepsi, would you believe that Pepsi ROI that you'd have the same one? No. So then let's not talk about ROI.
Yeah. I think one thing that is important is especially so you're going to have more success as a seller if you're able to connect whatever your solution is to a initiative within the organization. And I think it goes back to the operating rhythm that we were talking about here we're planning for the year, right? And we have a variety of initiatives that we have in place, whether it's shipping a new product or if it's raising our average selling price, right? Like our operating model for the coming year has built into it the fact that we need to raise our average selling price. Or a thing that's really in vogue right now that we hear quite a bit from our customers is, hey, we're reducing our marketing spend. We've compressed our SDR team. And as a result, what we need our account executives to do is to self-source more pipeline. And that what that means is more activity. Or if what that means is more activity in order to drive that. Okay, cool. So how are we managing that and how are we measuring this? And this is why, like, our sellers, when they're approaching these conversations, is they ask if there is a performance management initiative in place.
Yes.
Is there a pipeline generation initiative in place, right? Is there a pipeline advancement initiative in place, or is that something, because if there is, versus there being like a speculative thing, like, hey, this is not a priority, we haven't talked about this for this year. Another example of this might be an organization who has made a recent acquisition of another product, right? And so now the reason why they spent $50 million or $100 million on that product last year wasn't just for funsies. It was because now they want to sell that product this year. And so what that means is ensuring that in the economic model, that the people are doing the thing to cross-sell that product and generate opportunities associated. So the point is like when my sellers are approaching these conversations, if they have any chance of getting a unbudgeted, right, non-discretionary, but unbudgeted transaction done that is outside of the plan, it has to be connected to a thing that is being talked about at the board level, in the e-staff level, et cetera, et cetera. And so John McMahon of PTC fame, the qualified sales leader, et cetera, he calls this the pain above the noise, right? And so what you need to do is you need to connect to that, because if you're then showing up and saying, hey, I know that you guys have a very big problem on cross-selling this new acquisition. And right now that's not happening, because we're a third of the way through the year. And based on my conversation with sales enablement and the sales leaders and all this different discovery that I've done, it seems like there's maybe a training shortfall here. And so the good news is that we can fix that with specific training associated with cross-selling new product into existing customer base. And that will cost us 50, Richard Harris, can deliver that training. It's this many days, it costs this amount of money. And then that will do is that will solve this problem that you knew that this was something that was important, but now you're a third of the way, through the river, if you will, and you're realizing that you need. That is the sort of situation wherein the CFO will say, yes, because if we don't fix this problem now, we're going to totally miss our plan and it's going to be really sad. And so, yes, no problem, Richard. Here's your $50,000.
Exactly.
We're going to get on our merry way.
Thank you.
Right?
Where's I'm excited for the check, Pete. Thank you.
Yeah. So when having these conversations with the CFOs, how do you make sure that it doesn't feel adversarial?
Yeah. So I encourage this. This is the part about let's make sure we do everything we can to not make it adversarial. We can only control what we control. And I would say the same thing if you were talking about a CFO or going into procurement. Once you get to that level, right? My first question is to ask them straight up, help me understand what the role is here, right? Like I know that we talked about earlier, I know you have a fiduciary responsibility organization. I know that you've got to be able to report to the board that things have a meaningful impact on those things. Me understanding that, in terms of how you and I are going to communicate, Pete, Mr. CFO, are you here just to negotiate the price and the terms? Are you also going to help shepherd me through the legal process too? Does that go through you too? Just so I understand what your role is here. And that's the very first part of that conversation with them. It's not just about the pricing. It's being able to say to them, hey, I understand you have a responsibility, and I just want to make sure I understand how, what can I do to support that responsibility? How do I be a good vendor rather than just try to hammer you on price and you hammer me on price? So that's the first thing that you do. And I think it helps let a lot of pressure out of the room for everybody. It helps a lot of pressure out of the room for the salesperson to relax and exhale a little bit, and even the CFO, because I guarantee you, they're not having conversations this way with salespeople, and they're probably coming in trying to command the conversation. They're trying to run it through their process, and it'll still happen. But again, I want people to go to bed at night being able to go, well, at least I asked this question. At least I tried something that was different. And if I still got beat up on price, well, it's not because I didn't do my job. It's because that's just the way this rolled out, and their leadership and my leadership agreed on some silly negotiation tactic. So that's how I try to avoid the adversarial role.
Nice. The last thing I want to touch on is, so what we talked about was the concept of, potentially a discretionary transaction.
Right.
Right. We talked about unbudgeted, and there's unbudgeted discretionary, and then there's unbudgeted non-discretionary, right, where we have to create budget from somewhere else. And we talked about the CFO's role in both of those situations. In the first case, it's kind of like, hey, just keep it under a certain transaction size and you'll be able to slide it. In the second case, it's like, cool,
Right.
now we have to go to mom or go to dad and make an argument that we should take this money from the sibling and give it to you over here. Right. But let's talk about budgeted, right, and getting in the budget.
Yeah.
And because I think that that's a really important thing that that reps oftentimes, and also managers and leaders oftentimes kind of miss out, is that if you are in the budget and you're really in the budget, not just like kind of like, yeah, like you're on the list somewhere, you're on the wish list, you're on the wish list somewhere.
Right.
I think that can be a very powerful thing. And so the thing I'll note to folks is, again, go back to that operating rhythm. And what people will do is they execute on their year, right? And they're executing on a quarterly basis, and they have a QBR, and they look back and they say, what happened? Oh no, we're not cross-selling as well. We got to hire Richard in order to help us with that, with that initiative. Or so you do that on a quarterly basis. That's what QBRs are for. And then you do it at the end of the year. You look back across the whole year and you say, oh boy, how did we do? Where did we take our lumps? Where are there, areas for improvement? And then based on that, you flip around and then look forward and say, hey, we're going to change things. And so the things that you're going to change then, again, get embedded into the budget. And so if you show up and some organization is unhappy about whatever, some business pain that you solve, right? Like, hey, we're doing a great job with respect to our pipe gen, but boy, howdy, are we not advancing our pipe in any meaningful way? And I think it's because our managers are doing a poor job inspecting, and also they're not really tracking that pipe advancement. Let's say that's just an example. Okay, cool. That seems like a really big problem. When are you yes, and that's something we're going to want to tackle in a very meaningful way next year. Got it. Well, let's align with that future initiative. Right? Maybe we try to we see if we can make that happen right now in June or like August or whatever. Oh, we can't? Okay, cool. Now we can fall back and say, sounds like that's going to be a really important initiative next year. Let's make sure that we line up with that initiative and then get slotted in as a solution to that initiative that will be an initiative for next year now.
Yeah.
Right. And make sure that happens. And so I guess my question to you would be, and maybe we can kind of wrap with this, is how do you make sure that you're getting into the budget for next year, and then B, you're actually in the budget?
Yeah.
Right?
So there's this is my favorite way to do that. And it can apply to now, and it can easily apply to this operating rhythm of planning for next year. Look, early in every conversation, you and I both know every purchase decision is made by a committee. Nobody is willing to make a decision by themselves. They're afraid they're going to lose their job, point blank. And it really doesn't matter. This might shock people. I don't care who the decision maker is. I could care less, particularly early on. I already know it's a committee I'm not going to talk to. It's your boss and your boss's boss and probably a CFO. I already know who they are. Yet we're taught And I did it. Like I was taught this way and I taught it. And then I kind of realized like, oh, this isn't the best way to do it.
Mhm.
To go after that. That's not who I want to ask. I want to be able to go, hey, Pete, look, I know when we get off this conversation, I know you're going to talk about doing this for next year and you're going to have to bring it up internally. Like you're going to have some internal meetings. Pete's going to go, sure. I'll be like, great. Pete, whenever you try to bring up new initiatives and ideas at the organization, who are the most skeptical about that when it comes to your team's decisions? And what are they skeptical about?
Mhm.
Because you're not going to get to a decision maker until you talk to the skeptic or get through the skeptic. And so I need to know that way before I need the decision maker, like literally first call. Like I know you're going to go have a conversation, like unless you're in a transactional 1-call, 2-call close environment, there's always a committee. And even in those, it's like, I got to check with my spouse, my partner, my wife, my husband, whatever. Right? So who's the skeptic is the most important thing, right? And what are they skeptical about? And I ask all the time, right? And we know who those skeptics are going to be. We should know this is called marinating in the objection before the objection. Well, my CFO is going to be concerned about pricing. My CEO, my IT is going to be concerned about computer security and access to information. My security team is going to be concerned about that. My ops team is going to be concerned about all the other projects. So I need to know all that stuff way before I know who the decision maker is. So to get in the budget now, if there is a budget, you need to know the skeptics. And if you're planning for next year in August, great. Well, for you to go present this, what are people going to be skeptical about so that you, Pete, doesn't look foolish? I want to make sure Pete has the right information to present to say, look, I think we need this tool. I think we need Atrium because this is what it's going to help us solve, right? Because you're never in the room for the internal sales conversation ever.
Yeah.
You're never in the room when the decision's made. The decision's made before you have the conversation, right? Unless it's a 1-call close. Anyway, I'll end there, but that's sort of how I see how you get into the budget. And again, you still have to come back to that. Well, let's show what the economic impact is. Here's what it's going to cost you if you keep doing it this way.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, I hope that this was kind of like demystifying a little bit for folks around the role of the CFO, where they show up in transactions, how they show up in setting like operating plans into which your various solutions may or may not slot, and then how they feature in unbudgeted, like unplanned transactions. All of these things can be very important for for people who are selling when larger ticket items that oftentimes rise to the level of CFO scrutiny. Richard, this was super fantastic. I really appreciate you taking the time to kind of share this with us. Everyone, thank you very much for joining us. And I can't remember which session is after this, but go ahead and stick around. I'm sure it'll be absolutely fantastic. So Richard, good to see you and have a great rest of your day. Okay.
Thank you. You too. Thanks, everybody.